Well, we're here on West 22nd Street and we're going to run into the Chelsea Museum. Oh, and we're going to take a look at No, the art of Boris Lurie. Oh no. I guess it was last summer I was running around and I happened to drop into a gallery. I believe it was the Westwood Gallery, and maybe it was on West Broadway. And saw an exhibition, a small exhibition of the works of Boris Lurie there. And I was very struck. I'd actually seen examples of this work at an old catalog that had been published by the Gertrude Stein Gallery. I saw a small selection of these works, and it looks like they've got some of his early works here. And I was fascinated with this because in many ways I think that what Lurie was doing relates a lot to the kind of abject and pathetic art, kind of grungy collages that a lot of young artists out in Brooklyn are doing these days. Well, I think we'll start out with some of the early work. This is Untitled Three Women from 1955, and I was just talking with the curator, and he was saying that I guess Boris was from Germany or Poland, and his family was picked up by the Nazis, and everyone except he and his father were basically wiped out before they got to the concentration camp, and his father and he survived, and they immigrated to New York after the war. A lot of this looks like the kind of stuff you would see on 10th Street back in the early, maybe mid-50s. Well, I was just talking to Kate, and she said she saw a kind of a relationship between some of these early works and the work of Lester Johnson, who was a pretty influential artist down there in the Bowery. And I guess in the late 50s he started getting into a more kind of a surrealistic approach. But it seems that he was always working with female figures. Then I think probably in the late 50s,
I didn't see that show either.
That Boris sort of came up against a lot of resistance in the art world, and I guess there's a lot of existential angst going on at the time, and it was just kind of the downtown attitude was there was a real kind of negative, big, bummed out view of the world, and he and a couple of his friends started the No group, No Art. So I personally think that his real mature work didn't start until the No group sort of took off. And one of the things that I like about it was that they kind of took some of the same elements as the assemblage people like Rauschenberg and Keinholz, but they had a very, what you call a very kind of fatalistic, nasty, humanistic view of what was going on. This is called Bound in Red Love Series 1963, 80 by 53 inches, and it's unstretched canvas. And it looks like some kind of, maybe a photostatic print on there. This is one of the more famous of his images. This is called the Railroad Collage, and this got a lot of attention because he kind of mingled the image of this soft-core harlot laid over the view of a bunch of dead bodies from Buchenwald, I believe. And you can see that in a lot of ways he was dealing with the same kind of images as Warhol and Rauschenberg and Lichtenstein and Ray Johnson, but there was always a kind of desperate, almost frightening edge to it. This has kind of a formalist abstract quality here. So he often talked about how he was taking the images that were inundating us in our daily lives, products, sexuality, images of women being objectified. And I guess this was his way of counteracting the propaganda of commerce. Well, I find the work interesting because in a lot of ways it is a harbinger of a lot of art that's being done today, but I think it's also a potent protest against kind of slickness and commercialization that a lot of art, even back in the early 60s, was going through. I think that this work had a lot in common with what people like Rauschenberg and Oldenburg and even Jasper Johns were doing at the time, but they kind of were coming out of Duchamp with a kind of a cerebral nonchalance about the work. And although superficially they might look like they're similar, I think Lurie and the No Artists always had a most brutal, humanistic, primitive aspect to them. This is kind of nice. This is called Suitcase, 1963. On the label it says, "The mixed memory and desire are the baggage of humanity and the tragedy of the hope we all bear, even against our will." I think something like this, he's really capturing the kind of brush action that somebody like Franz Klein or Grace Hardigan was using. He's actually pretty good with his color. It's kind of nice. He's got this group of playing cards that kind of divide the center of the composition. I think it was 1963 or 64 that Boris Lurie and Stanley Fischer put together a show, and I think it was titled The Last Sculpture Show, or maybe The No Sculpture Show, and it was basically an exhibition of shit, and they presented the exhibition at the Gertrude Stein Gallery, and that was just about the same time that Piero Manzoni did his canned artist shit, and since then there's been a whole school of the shit artists, but No Art was one of the first groups that promoted that. Well, now we're talking to the curator, John Ranowski. So tell us a little bit about the show and some of the legacy that Boris Lurie is carrying on here.
The idea that Boris Lurie has a legacy is almost absurd. Boris Lurie's legacy was self-consciously, more or less, suppressed by the art world, and it's clawed its way back from the grave to be in front of you now. Boris spent much of the last years of his life making money so that he wouldn't have to lose his art entirely, and so that it would have the possibility of an afterlife.
And this was in the stock market that he made the money?
That's correct. He was a very astute stock speculator.
Now, do you see this work as having any kind of influence on some of the young artists in places like Williamsburg and
I think it's
Boston.
obvious that strains of this art persist. I fear that they persist of their own accord, not necessarily by a train of influence. I think that Boris's work was sufficiently unknown for such a long period of time that it would be improbable that very many young artists, at least, who seem to me to be not terribly historically aware, could have been influenced by it. On the other hand, the ideas that inform his art are constant and necessary humane ideals, and I can't imagine that any thoughtful young artist would be incapable of arriving at a similar perspective through his own experience.
One other final question I have is about the No Sculpture show, his shit show. He and, was it Stanley Fisher that they put together?
That's right.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Of course, I didn't have that experience. I was about 6 years old at the time when the shit show was mounted in 1964 at Gallery Gertrude Stein. Boris Lurie, Sam Goodman, and Stanley Fisher deplored what they called the investment art market.
Yes.
And they created a body of work, as it were, in the form of shit. It wasn't real shit, it was sculptures made to look like shit. And they said, here you are, art world, wallow in this. And the art world actually, for once, in relation to their work, did wallow in it. They loved the work. They thought this was a statement that meant something to them. Boris Lurie smacked himself in the head and said, my God, it's worse than I thought.
Okay. Thank you, John, and congratulations on the show.
Thank you.
I'm really enjoying it.
Thank you, James.
This is James Combe reporting on No, the art of Boris Lurie, here at the Chelsea Museum. Thanks, Kate.